A little talk now about how socialism has worked or not worked in the real world. We had two large countries that had socialist or communist governments, and again, we don't need to get caught up into the terminology. We had a number of smaller countries from Vietnam to Cuba that also had those kind of governments. And the question is, do we think those governments worked? And the answer from most economists is no, that those governments were ineffective. And in fact, almost all of those countries have switched to some form of mixed capitalist system. Socialist economies by nature what we call command economies. Workers and consumers in those economies had little choice. What happened in those economies happened by order, by decision from the top down. So it happened by command. People were commanded to do things. And yes, that's kind of like a class you take, because most of what happens in class happens because I tell you that that's the way it's going to happen. Socialism requires what we call planning. In socialism, we don't leave it to the business to decide how much stuff it needs to make. We tell the business how much stuff it needs to make. We tell the business you're getting these workers and these raw materials, and from those you have to make these things. There's people sitting up at the top in their little cubicle, and in Russia there was an organization called Gosplan, Gosplan, and they planned out the whole economy. If we need to make this many cars, we need to have steel and iron and rubber and plastic, and they would take the final product, the car, figure out how many they needed, work backwards to figure out how much steel and where the steel would come from and how many workers you needed to make that steel. This is a very complex process that's not likely to work very well. Kind of in between socialism and capitalism is fascism. Remember that Nazi stands for National Socialist, so it's a combination of nationalism and socialism. It's fascism. In fascism, you still have private ownership of the capital. So you have privately owned businesses, but in a sense, the government tells them what to do. Fascism is this it's tying together a bunch of things, like a bunch of sticks that are tied together. So the businesses, instead of deciding on their own what they're going to do, the government decides what they're going to do, but it's still owned and operated by an individual who can still make money off it. So Nazi Germany, Italy during World War II, Japan during World War II were fascist economies where the government is making the essential decisions at the top, but people still own the factories. And some economists regard fascist economies as being very efficient, but none of those countries as being exactly free or places that you'd want to be particularly. And of course, brutal in a lot of ways. I put a Volkswagen up here because what happens in Germany, for example, is that Adolf Hitler wants there to be cars that the average German-built cars that the average German person can buy. So he goes to Mr. Porsche and says, I want you to build a car. You need to build a car for the common folk, a Volkswagen. And from that we get Volkswagens, and Mr. Porsche designs the Bug, the Volkswagen Beetle, and that becomes the car for the masses in Germany. And that company was a private company, and it's still around, but they didn't have a choice of what to produce. They had a choice of what that little car should look like and how it should be built and designed and all of that, but they didn't have a choice of what their end product would be. So fascism is kind of in between what we think of as socialism today and capitalism today. It had planning, but not all the way down. So imagine that we're in Soviet Union, in Russia, when they were communist socialist. Somebody at the top had to figure out how many nails needed to be produced every year and what sizes of nails needed to be produced. You can't just say to a factory, make a whole bunch of nails, because they'll make little tiny nails just to get to their number quota. If you say to a factory, make 1 million pounds of nails, they're going to make really big nails, because that's the easiest way to make 1 million pounds of nails. What happens is this question again of incentives. The factory's incentive is to do as little as possible to make their requirements happen. And so the government has to make those requirements very specific. And the more specific the government makes them, then the more likely it is that they make a mistake in what they ask you to produce. And the whole system becomes far too complex and far too prone to errors. The same thing applies to the people who live in these economies. So in China or Soviet Union, when they were communist, the government basically was taking every child as they grew up and deciding what that child was going to be when they grew up. So rather than me saying, hey, I want to be an economist, they might have decided that I should be a mathematician or who knows. They decided whether you would go to school. They decided for how long you would go to school. They decided what you would get trained in. If they decided you were going to be a plumber, you were going to be a plumber. The system created no incentives for individuals. In fact, it's creating bad incentives for individuals. In these systems, the government also has to set prices. So what the government's going to do all the time is set prices low. The government's going to want to be able to say, look, prices are really low in our economy. Isn't that great? But what happens when prices are low? When prices are below what we would consider to be equilibrium? Well, when prices are really low, consumers are going to want to buy more than businesses have available to sell, and every product is always going to be in what we call a shortage. There's not going to be enough of any product because the prices are too low. If you look at the way the Soviet Union ran, you'll see that there were lines everywhere. Anything you wanted to do, any economic activity you want to participate in, go to a restaurant, go to a store, go wherever, you would have to stand in line, and that's because the prices are too low. So again, if prices are too low, we get what's called a shortage, and we end up with lines. If prices are too high, we get a surplus. Stuff sits in the store shelves and nobody buys it. But a socialist economy, a government-run economy, is not going to do that because they don't want that appearance. So prices are always going to be too low, and everybody's always going to have to stand in line. So let's compare this a little bit to capitalist strengths. Again, we just talked about incentives. The Karl Marxian view is from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. So you get enough from society to live and function, but you're supposed to work at your best. Well, why would you do that? What incentive do you have? If you get the same pay, regardless of whether you work hard and try your best or whether you sit around and do nothing and just barely manage to do enough to keep your job, which choice are you going to choose? If you're not sure, think about Department of Motor Vehicles. You've been to DMV, maybe, and you know that you go in there and you can wait hours and hours sometimes. No capitalist business could possibly function like that, but DMV does. You have a government entity. You have essentially a socialist entity. And the workers at DMV get paid the same whether they get everybody in and out in 5 minutes or they get everybody in and out in 5 hours. There are political reasons why governments try to speed up what happens at DMV, but there's no incentive for the workers to do it. In a system without positive incentives, why would you write a song? Some people will write songs because it's a way to express themselves and it's fun and everything else. But most people put their heart and soul into the music business because they want to make money. Just ask Metallica why they do what they do, and in the end it comes down to money. Why would you invent the Iron Man suit and become a big capitalist if it pays the same as somebody who works 8 hours a day and goes home? You're not. The reason that you try to become something special is because there's an incentive. There's some reward for that other than just your own personal gain. So some people are still going to do what they do for personal reasons. We don't think that socialism is summer. We think it's winter. Socialism has what we call perverse incentives. It means that the incentives push us away from efficiency, push us away from the economy doing what it's supposed to do. Socialist systems tend to not be innovative. The Russians were infamous for stealing intellectual property because they couldn't really innovate. They had trouble getting people to innovate. China has this huge record of stealing intellectual property. The innovation comes from the capitalist side of the house, not the socialist side of the house. And then for you as an individual, there are few opportunities. How do you get what you want to be if the government tells you what your education is, what your job is, what your training is? The government is telling you how you're going to live your life, even where you're going to live. It's not a system that's good for human beings and human freedom and all those things that we like about capitalism. Which again does not mean that capitalism has all the answers or that our economist thinks that capitalism has all the answers. Every country in the world is some kind of mixed system. We're all in a blender, and it's a question of how much is capitalism and how much is socialism. Even in the old Soviet Union, farmers were allowed to grow crops on small plots of land and then get on the train and take their products into the city and sell them. So the only way that Moscow actually got fed when Russia was communist was for a little bit of capitalism to operate inside of the socialism. And at the same time, there are things that capitalism doesn't do well and countries have provided socialism. So most of the world, developed world, Western Europe, Australia, Japan, Canada, they have socialized medicine for everybody. In the United States, we don't. But, so in England, they have the National Health Service. It provides medicine for everyone. The outcomes, two important things to understand here. One is that if you look at the healthcare outcomes in Western Europe or in Australia or Canada and compare them to the United States, the outcomes are the same. Their systems don't do better than ours, and our system doesn't do better than theirs. But healthcare costs half as much. So the government, the percent of GDP in those countries that goes to healthcare is half of what it is in the United States. So healthcare is a lot less expensive. Outcomes are just the same, but it costs us twice as much. The other side to that, though, is if you want an elective procedure, you want your nose fixed because you don't like your nose, the national health system might not do that and might not pay anything toward it, and you might have to pay the whole thing. Or the national system might do it, but you might have to wait 6 months, a year. So there are positives and negatives about national health care. And in fact, in the United States, we do have socialized medicine in the form of Medicare and Medicaid. A significant part of our population is in a socialized medicine system. The Veterans Administration, Medicare, Medicaid, those are all single provider, government run healthcare systems. And we know that the veterans healthcare system in the U.S. has had terrible outcomes and not done very well. Most people are pretty favorable when it comes to Medicare and what Medicare does, even though there's a lot of fraud in Medicare. We know that there's a huge amount of fraud in Medicare, in fact, and it doesn't provide some of the services that people need. So there's always going to be these arguments, and that's one of the things economists always know. There's always costs and benefits. There's always pluses and minuses. There's always the good and the bad, and you have to consider both sides. So generally speaking, most economists believe capitalism is more efficient than socialism. In other words, for the same resources, you get more in a capitalist system than you do in a socialist system. And again, we've seen China, Russia, all of Eastern Europe, Vietnam move away from socialism and toward capitalism because capitalism is more productively efficient. It produces more stuff from the same resources. But we're well aware that there are flaws in capitalism, and we're debating, and there's still, the guy up at the top there, Milton Friedman, is a champion of free markets, and the guy, little Karl Marx there, has told us lessons about why those markets might not work right. We have to look at where capitalism works, doesn't work, and how we play with that. Remember, as we talk about this, because this is a class on the Constitution, the Constitution is built on a philosophy of individual rights. That's the foundation of the Constitution. Life, liberty, and property, protecting the people from the government. It doesn't say capitalism anywhere in the Constitution, but the Constitution is not about a socialist system where the government tells you what to do. The Founding Fathers pretty universally believed that the government was potentially a problem more than it was potentially a solution, that there were certain things that the government would help with. But most of the time, the government needed to stay away from people, and we needed to make sure that we didn't get tyranny instead of liberty. So we'll talk about that in different situations now as we go forward. We economists are pretty strong believers in capitalism, most of us, not all of us. If you look at some of what happened in countries that were predominantly socialist or fascist, you look at Nazi Germany, you look at Russia, China, millions of people dying, people starving to death, millions and millions of people, economies. You wouldn't want to be a person who lived in any one of those countries unless you were in the elite, the whatever. And Karl Marx complains about inequality in the capitalist system, but we probably saw more of that in these socialist countries than we saw in the capitalist system. This is something that we'll explore as we go along and that you might want to explore as well.